The nurse didn't even look up. She just snapped, "We don't treat street kids here." Zayden stood frozen, cradling his unconscious little brother as Christmas lights blinked mockingly through the ER glass. A crowd watched. No one moved. No one helped. That night, the hospital left him out in the cold. But hours later, that same street kid walked back in and saved a life they were about to lose. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The snow came down like punishment. Baltimore hadn't seen a storm this vicious in years. Winds howled down narrow alleyways, turning every corner into a whiteout. Streetlights flickered behind veils of snow, casting halos over frozen sidewalks. Ambulance sirens echoed through the night, but even those felt muffled beneath the thick curtain of cold. And somewhere in the chaos, Zayden Cole ran. His breath came in frantic clouds as he sprinted down East Jefferson, cradling the limp body of his younger brother, Micah, wrapped in an oversized hoodie. The 13-year-old's skin was pale, his lips tinged a dangerous blue. His body felt too light, too quiet. Zayden didn't care about the snow biting into his hands, or the fact that he had no gloves. All he knew was that Micah needed help. And fast. Mercy Grace Hospital's red emergency sign finally pierced the blur ahead. Zayden didn't stop running. His shoes, soaked and torn, slipped on the ice-slick pavement. But he caught himself, clutching Micah tighter. The sliding doors hissed open. Inside, the ER buzzed with chaos. Nurses moved quickly between beds. Monitors beeped. Families huddled on chairs, whispering prayers into the cold fluorescent air. Zayden burst into the lobby, his eyes wide, frantic. "Help! Please!" He passed out. Zayden shouted, his voice cracking. "He can't breathe right. I think he's having a seizure or something." Several heads turned. A white nurse behind the reception desk raised an eyebrow. Marlene Whitaker. Late 50s, salt and pepper bun, pristine uniform. Her face was stone as she stared at the two brothers, one soaking wet, the other barely conscious. A black teenager in saggy jeans, hair wild under the snow, carrying another boy like a wounded soldier. To her it was just another hood story. "Sir, step back," Marlene said sharply, already waving a security guard over. "Where are your parents?"
He needs help now.
Zayden begged, stepping forward. "He's my little brother. He collapsed like 10 minutes ago. I think it's asthma or something. Please just look at him." Marlene's lips curled into a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "We don't treat street kids here," she said loud enough for others to hear. "This is a trauma center, not a homeless shelter. You can try City General, 2 blocks down." Zayden blinked. For a moment he thought he misheard. But no, the sneer on her face confirmed it. His chest tightened, but not from the cold, from something worse. Something that crawled up his throat and made him want to scream. He looked down at Micah's face. The boy's head lolled to the side, his breath shallow. "I'm not asking for charity," Zayden said, voice lower now, shaking. "I'm begging for help." Behind Marlene, another nurse, younger, glanced at the scene nervously, but said nothing. A white security guard stepped forward, hand hovering near his belt. Not a weapon, but the gesture was clear. "You don't belong here. Not like this." Marlene leaned closer, her voice now just for him. "If I let every one of you in here, we'd never have room for real emergencies. Now move, before I call the police." Zayden felt it then. The humiliation, the disbelief, the sharp, paralyzing sting of being seen as nothing. Not a brother, not a human, just a statistic. "I'll carry him myself," he said, stepping toward the doors that led to triage. The security guard grabbed his arm. "You're trespassing," he said. "Leave now." That was when Micah coughed. A dry, cracking cough that rattled his whole body. His eyes fluttered open for half a second, before rolling back. His arms twitched. "He's seizing," Zayden yelled, his voice breaking. "He's fucking seizing." "Language," Marlene snapped. Zayden looked around, desperate. No one moved. The nurses looked down. The guard's grip tightened. The waiting room, silent. He wanted to punch the walls, scream, beg. Instead, he did something worse. He gave up. Zayden turned and walked out, barefoot on one side where his soul had torn clean through. The snow hit his face like slaps. Still, he didn't stop. He walked into the dark, cradling his brother like a broken promise. Back inside, Marlene rolled her eyes and turned to her monitor. "We can't save everyone," she muttered under her breath. But Zayden wasn't walking away in surrender. He was walking away with a decision, because someone would help them. or he would make them. 10 blocks away, the storm thickened. Zayden ducked into an alley beside an abandoned laundromat, crouching behind a dumpster to shield Micah from the wind. He tore off his own hoodie and wrapped it tighter around his brother. The boy shivered uncontrollably. "Hold on," Zayden whispered, his voice trembling. "Please just hold on." He pulled out his cracked phone. No battery. Tears stung his eyes, but he wiped them away. He couldn't break. Not tonight. Not with Micah like this. That's when headlights swept across the alley. A van slowed, then stopped. Zayden froze. A man stepped out. Tall, white paramedic jacket, salt-crusted boots. "Hey!" the man shouted. "You okay?" Zayden stood quickly, shielding Micah. "He needs a hospital. They turned us away. They said he's a street kid." The man squinted. "Wait. Who said that?" "Mercy Grace," Zayden said. "They told me to go to City General, but it's far. I think he's dying. I can't carry him anymore." The man moved fast. "Put him in. I'm Jesse. Paramedic, off-duty, doesn't matter now. I'm taking him myself." Zayden didn't ask questions. He climbed in. Inside the van, Jesse laid Micah on a stretcher and checked his vitals. Pulse is weak. Breathing's shallow. He needs oxygen and a warm environment. Zayden sat beside him, eyes wide. "Will he live?" Jesse glanced at him. "We'll make sure he does." As the van peeled away through the snow, Zayden finally allowed himself to cry, not from weakness, from relief. But he didn't realize that Jesse was driving them right back to Mercy Grace Hospital. They arrived minutes later. The emergency doors slid open again, warm fluorescent light spilling into the frozen night. Jesse burst in with the stretcher, pushing Micah ahead, seizing pediatric patient. "Cold exposure. Probable respiratory distress," Jesse announced. Nurses rushed toward them. All except one. Marlene stood rooted near the reception desk, her mouth parting in disbelief. Zayden stepped through the doors behind Jesse, soaked and silent. Their eyes met. His were full of fury, hers of something else. Recognition. And fear. "Didn't I tell you?" she began. But Jesse cut her off. "I found him outside in 20-degree weather. This boy's been carrying his brother for 20 blocks. He came here first. You turned them away?" I didn't realize." "You knew," Jesse snapped. "And you didn't care." The commotion drew the attention of the ER supervisor. Within seconds, legal conversations started. Someone whispered about calling Child Protective Services. A nurse took Micah to triage. Cameras picked up every second of it. Zayden didn't say another word. He just stood in the middle of the lobby, drenched, shaking but still standing. Jesse placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, kid." Zayden didn't look at him. His eyes never left Marlene. She turned away, clutching her clipboard too tight. That night, Zayden didn't go home. He vanished into the storm, not out of fear, not out of weakness. He vanished because now, he had something bigger than a grudge. He had purpose, and he wasn't done with that hospital yet. Zayden vanishes into the night, but he wasn't done with that hospital yet. The streets didn't feel like streets anymore. They felt like punishment, wide frozen slabs of concrete that turned beneath Zayden's feet into a hostile wilderness. Street lamps flickered overhead, barely visible through the sheets of white. Every gust of wind hit like a shove from the universe, as if telling him, "You're not welcome here." With every step, Zayden's body grew heavier. His arms ached from holding Micah, who had stopped twitching and now lay still, dangerously still. His face had lost color, and Zayden couldn't feel the boy's breath anymore. The snow had crusted around Micah's eyelashes, and part of Zayden feared what he'd see if he dared to stop and check for a pulse. But he kept walking, because stopping meant surrender. And Zayden didn't know how to surrender. Not when Micah's life still pulsed faintly in his arms. People passed. Not many, but enough to show the world still spun. A bundled-up woman crossed the street to avoid him. A man at the corner gas station watched silently, sipping coffee as Zayden struggled past. No one asked questions. No one offered help, even as he whispered for someone, anyone, to call an ambulance. Eyes averted like his pain wasn't worth the weight of attention. He stumbled against a frozen bus bench and dropped to one knee, catching Micah before he slipped from his grasp. Snow soaked his jeans. The cold bit through his jacket, which he had wrapped tightly around Micah's body. His arms, raw and red, shook as he tried to lift his brother again. Still no one helped. Somewhere deep inside him, something cracked. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough. Enough to make him stop believing in the systems they told him were there for everyone. He began to cry, not sobbing, but quiet, choked weeping into the shoulder of the boy who still hadn't stirred. The kind of crying that came not from fear but from the horror of having your worst suspicion confirmed. They really don't care about kids like us. But then headlights cut through the swirling snow. A van pulled up across the street and slowed, braking awkwardly near the curb. A window rolled down halfway. "You need help?" a voice called out. White, male, slightly uncertain, but alert. Zayden looked up. The figure inside had sharp features, a thick brown jacket, with a paramedic patch barely visible under the snow dust. His face wasn't cruel or cautious, just confused, trying to understand what he was seeing. Zayden didn't answer with words. He just turned Micah's face toward the man and let the silence speak. The man was out of the van in seconds. He jogged across the street, boots crunching hard over ice, and crouched beside them without hesitation. He checked Micah's airway, pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck, then looked at Zayden. "What happened? How long's he been like this?" Zayden sniffled, trying to speak, but the cold stifled his voice. "They wouldn't help us. Mercy grace. They turned us away, said we don't belong there." The man blinked. His expression shifted, confusion to disbelief, disbelief to disgust. He didn't ask for more. "Name's Jesse," he said. "I'm off shift, but I've got gear in the van. Get in. Now." Zayden hesitated, just long enough to question if he was making a mistake. But Jesse didn't ask for trust. He didn't try to play hero. He just moved fast. Inside the van, warmth hit like a defibrillator. Jesse turned on the heat, pulled out a field oxygen tank, attached a pediatric mask, and gently placed it over Micah's face. He wrapped the boy in a thermal blanket, pulled from the back and cranked the heat. Zayden sat beside his brother, eyes fixed on the stillness of the boy's chest. "He's not as he..." Zayden's voice cracked. "He's breathing. Shallow. But he's there," Jesse said. "We've got to get him back to a hospital. Fast." "No," Zayden said, instinctively. "Not Mercy Grace. They won't." "They have the equipment," Jesse interrupted. "And they're closest. We don't have time for a 20-minute drive in this storm. You trust me?" Zayden hesitated. "Do I have a choice?" Jesse didn't answer. He turned the wheel, hit the gas, and the van rolled back into the storm. The ride felt like a dream in reverse. Zayden watched as they drove toward the same place that had humiliated him, that had treated his desperation like a stain. His stomach twisted. Micah stirred beside him, a faint groan. Zayden leaned closer, his voice shaking with relief. "You're okay. Stay with me, all right? Just stay awake." The boy didn't respond, but that groan meant the world hadn't taken him yet. Minutes later, the red emergency sign reappeared through the snow. Mercy Grace Hospital. The van skidded slightly, as Jesse braked too hard, parking crooked near the ambulance entrance. He jumped out, opened the side door, and began unloading Micah on a collapsible stretcher. Zayden stood frozen, his breath fogging the van's window. This place again. The humiliation, the looks, the security guard's grip still haunted his skin. Jesse called back, urgency in his tone. "You coming?" Zayden nodded and followed. The moment the doors slid open, it was like nothing had changed. Fluorescent lights, antiseptic air, and that invisible wall between who gets helped and who gets ignored. Nurses moved quickly, but none noticed them yet. Jesse pushed through with authority, shouting over the commotion. "Pediatric patient. Cold trauma and possible seizure. Oxygen administered en route. Needs immediate triage." Finally, heads turned. One nurse glanced toward the commotion. Then she stepped into view. Marlene Whitaker, clipboard in hand. Eyes still sharp, lips pursed in perpetual disapproval. And the moment she spotted Zayden behind the stretcher, her whole body stiffened. For a second it was like a crack in time. Zayden's heart stopped. The same judgmental glare. The same dismissive presence. She saw him, not his brother, not the emergency, but him, and the way her eyes narrowed made it clear she hadn't changed her mind since the last time. Jesse called out again, this time more forceful. "Can we get a room? He's fading fast." Marlene stepped forward slowly. "We're at capacity. You should have called ahead." Zayden stared at her in disbelief. "He's dying, and you're checking a clipboard?" Other nurses paused, unsure whether to follow Marlene's lead or act on instinct. The power of hierarchy in the room was palpable. But Zayden wasn't powerless this time. "You gonna wait till he dies again?" His voice cut through the tension like broken glass. Jesse glanced back at Zayden, something clicking in his expression, a realization that this was personal, that Zayden had already been here, that he had already begged, And this was the woman who had turned them away. A heavy silence fell, until Marlene stepped aside and waved them through. "Room 4, she said flatly. "But I'll need the paramedic's ID." Jesse didn't respond. He pushed the stretcher forward. Zayden followed, past the sliding doors, into the hallway he never thought he'd see again. They were finally inside. But just as the automatic doors closed behind them, something unexpected happened. A second nurse, mid-30s, black, emerged from a side room. She looked from Zayden to the stretcher, then to Marlene. Her expression tight. "Marlene, didn't this kid come here earlier?" she asked, her voice sharp. Marlene didn't answer. And in that silence, heavy, loaded, racial, something shifted in the room. Zayden had allies now. But just as the tension reached its peak, an alarm blared from the triage wing. Code Gray, security lockdown. Doors slid shut behind them. Lights shifted. The hospital went into emergency lockdown due to an unrelated incident in the psych wing. Zayden turned around. The doors to the ER snapped shut, locking him inside with the very nurse who tried to shut him out. When they reached the same hospital again, Zayden recognizes the nurse on duty, and the doors slam shut in his face again. But this time he's not on the outside. The lockdown lights cast Mercy Grace Hospital in a sterile blue, flattening faces and freezing motion into something unnatural. Doors sealed with pneumatic finality. The intercom repeated calm instructions that fooled no one. In the triage corridor, Marlene Whitaker stood with her clipboard held like a shield, her posture rigid, her jaw set so tightly it ached. She could feel the eyes on her nurses, who had worked under her for years, a paramedic who had not, and a black teenager who had already learned exactly how little protection a hospital could offer him when prejudice wore a uniform. Marlene told herself she was doing her job. She always did. The words were a mantra she repeated when her chest tightened. When the past rose uninvited, when she noticed the patterns she insisted were just coincidences. She had trained herself to believe that professionalism was the absence of emotion. But the truth was more complicated, and far uglier. Years ago, before the lines on her face deepened, and before the bun of her hair became a permanent fixture, Marlene had been a mother first. Her daughter, Lily, had been 17, reckless in the way teenagers often are, full of plans that bloomed faster than caution. On a humid summer night, Lily borrowed the car without permission and drove to meet friends. She never came home. The accident report was blunt, clinical, merciless. A collision at an intersection. A driver fled the scene. Witnesses were uncertain. Rumors were not. The rumor that stuck, the one whispered by neighbors and echoed by local news commentary, named a black teenager from the East Side. No charges were ever filed. No proof emerged. The investigation stalled, then closed. But grief does not need evidence to choose a target. Marlene's grief, sharpened by a justice system that offered no answers, latched onto a story that made sense of chaos. It gave her pain a direction. It told her who to blame. She never said it out loud at first. She just noticed how her shoulders stiffened when black boys came through the ER doors late at night. How she scrutinized their stories more closely. How she delayed triage when they lacked insurance or identification. How easy it was to tell herself that rules were rules, that resources were limited, that she was protecting the hospital from being overwhelmed. Over time, the boundary between caution and contempt blurred until it disappeared. In the present, as the lockdown hummed and the corridor filled with controlled urgency, Marlene's gaze slid back to Zayden. He stood near the wall, wet clothes drying stiffly against his skin, eyes fixed on the room where Micah had been taken. There was no posturing in him now, no bravado, just a terrible patience, the kind that comes from being forced to wait too often. Marlene felt a flicker of something she didn't recognize at first. It was not guilt. She would have named that. It was not fear. She knew fear well. It was dissonance. Zayden didn't fit the shape she had carved into her mind over years of selective noticing. He wasn't demanding anything for himself. He wasn't loud or threatening. He had done everything right, and still nearly lost his brother. The story she told herself had no room for that. She turned away and focused on the chart in her hands, reading, without absorbing. In her head, Lily's laugh echoed, the way it had sounded when she danced in the kitchen, when she teased Marlene for being too serious. The memory came with a familiar bitterness. Lily had been good. Lily had been careful. Lily had deserved more time. Marlene had deserved answers. The world had given her none. A nurse approached, lowering her voice. The younger woman was careful, respectful, but there was an edge of concern that Marlene recognized and resented. We're getting conflicting readings on the pediatric patient, she said. Respiration stabilized with oxygen, but his blood pressure's off. There's something else. Run the standard panel, Marlene replied. We don't need guesses. The nurse hesitated. He has a medical bracelet. It mentions an allergy. Marlene's eyes flicked up. We'll note it. We should verify it before. I said we'll note it, Marlene repeated. Sharper now. She felt the old irritation rise, the sense that she was being challenged in front of outsiders. She did not look at Satan as she spoke, but she felt his presence like a pressure change. Jesse, standing nearby, shifted his weight. He had been quiet since the doors closed, watching, cataloging. He didn't raise his voice when he spoke, but the words landed heavily. He mentioned asthma and seizures. Allergies can complicate both. Marlene met his gaze. We're handling it. The truth she would never admit was that she didn't want Zayden to be right about anything. She didn't want his vigilance to matter. If it did, then her judgment, her certainty would crack. And once it cracked, she wasn't sure what would be left. As orders were relayed and footsteps echoed down the hall, Marlene drifted back into herself, into the night that had shaped her. After Lily's funeral, the casseroles stopped coming. The sympathy cards dried up. People moved on. Marlene didn't. She filed complaints when the investigation slowed. She watched footage that showed nothing. She read online forums that offered theories and names without proof. Each one fed the same conclusion. Each one hardened her. When she returned to work, she wore her grief like armor. Patients became cases. Teenagers became risks. Compassion became conditional. And the hospital, with its protocols and hierarchies, rewarded that hardness. She rose to head nurse not because she was cruel, but because she was efficient, because she didn't hesitate, because she could say no. Now in the humming blue light, she sensed the cost of that efficiency circling back. The younger black nurse who had questioned her earlier passed by again, eyes flicking from Marlene to Zayden. There was recognition there. Solidarity. Marlene felt it like a slap. Zayden shifted, finally breaking his silence. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of the last hour. My aunt taught me about meds, he said, not loudly, not accusingly. Some drugs make his breathing worse. If you give him the wrong one. We are not taking medical advice from a child, Marlene cut in, the words sharper than she intended. The corridor went still. Even the intercom seemed to pause. Zayden didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, and in that look was something Marlene had not expected. Recognition. Not of authority, but of fear. He saw her not as an untouchable gatekeeper, but as someone desperately trying to keep the world simple enough to survive. The realization unsettled her more than anger would have. From down the hall came the squeak of wheels. A gurney approached fast, pushed by two orderlies moving with the urgency reserved for cases that had already turned. A critical patient, older, pale, oxygen mask fogging with shallow breaths. The nurse at the head called out vitals, numbers tumbling over one another. The lockdown had delayed transfer. The delay had consequences. As the gurney passed, Zayden's attention snapped to it. His gaze sharpened, tracking the patient with an intensity that surprised even him. He took a half step forward, then stopped, eyes fixed on the IV line, on the label fluttering with each movement. Marlene noticed his focus and bristled. Stay where you are. Zayden's voice cut through the corridor, low but urgent. That medication, he swallowed, choosing his words carefully, as if he knew how easily he could be dismissed. That patient's symptoms don't match it. It's not an infection. It's enough, Marlene said. You've done enough. But the unexpected twist came not from defiance, but from knowledge. Zayden had seen the same pattern before, months ago, when his aunt had rushed a neighbor to a clinic and recognized a reaction that looked like something else. He had watched her stop a mistake before it became fatal. He had learned that medicine was as much about noticing as it was about authority. The gurney rolled closer to the room where Micah lay. The air seemed to thin. Jesse glanced between Zayden and the patient, something dawning on him as well. The younger nurse slowed, listening. Marlene felt the floor tilt beneath her certainty. For the first time in years, she hesitated, not because she doubted the protocol, but because she doubted herself. Lily's face flashed in her mind, not as a victim, but as a girl who would have wanted someone to speak up if something was wrong. The orderlies paused, waiting for direction. The corridor held its breath. Zayden spoke again, quieter now, but unmistakably sure. If you give that to him, it'll make it worse. He's allergic, and so is my brother. Marlene looked at the chart in her hands. The allergy notation stared back at her. Small but undeniable. She had waved it off. She had chosen speed over scrutiny, control over care. The gurney wheels creaked to a stop. A critical patient is wheeled in. The medication hangs ready, and only Zayden recognizes what's really wrong. The corridor felt narrower once the truth landed. Zayden's warning had stopped the gurney cold. And for a suspended moment, the hospital revealed its real anatomy, not the walls and wires, but the hierarchy that decided whose voice counted. Marlene's authority wavered. The orderlies hesitated, and the younger nurse reached instinctively for the IV line, fingers hovering as if they could sense danger before permission arrived. The lockdown lights hummed overhead, casting everyone in the same cold blue flattening rank and race into silhouettes that suddenly looked unsure of themselves. Jesse moved first. He stepped into the space between the gurney and the room, his tone measured but unyielding. "Hold the medication," he said, not as a suggestion. "Check the allergy, now." He met Marlene's eyes, and the look he gave her wasn't hostile. It was incredulous. The kind that asked how someone could stand so close to harm and still choose procedure over people. Marlene glanced at the chart again, then at Zayden. The boy hadn't moved. He didn't need to. His certainty had done the work for him. The younger nurse confirmed the allergy aloud, the word ringing in the corridor like a bell. Orders shifted. The medication was withdrawn. The gurney rolled again, this time toward a different room, a different protocol. The crisis passed, but it left a residue that clung to everything. Jesse exhaled slowly and turned his attention back to Micah. The boy lay behind glass now, small chest rising unevenly beneath the thermal blanket. Machines whispered and beeped, translating his body into numbers that could be monitored and managed. Zayden stood close, hands jammed into his pockets, eyes never leaving his brother. He looked older than he had an hour ago, older than he should have. "Thank you," Zayden said quietly, not looking at Jesse. The gratitude wasn't polite. It was raw-edged with the knowledge of how easily it could have gone the other way. Jesse nodded. "You did the saving," he replied. "I just listened." That was when the hospital pushed back. A woman in a tailored coat approached, heels clicking against the floor, with the confidence of someone who knew the building bent around her schedule. She introduced herself as risk management, her smile tight, her eyes sharp. She didn't ask about Micah's condition. She asked Jesse for his identification. "You're off duty," she said, glancing at his badge. "You're not authorized to administer care or interfere with triage decisions." Jesse didn't argue the technicality. He had known the risk the moment he pulled over on the street. What surprised him was the speed with which the institution closed ranks, not to correct a mistake, but to contain a narrative. He felt the familiar frustration rise, the one that had driven him into emergency medicine in the first place. The sense that the rules were often used to protect systems, not lives. "I documented everything," Jesse said evenly. "Times, statements, refusals, and I took photos." The woman's smile faltered. "Photos of what?" "Of a minor being denied emergency care," Jesse replied. "Of a head nurse making a discriminatory statement. Of a hospital choosing convenience over urgency." Marlene stiffened at the word discriminatory, her mouth tightening as if to deny it could apply to her. The risk manager's eyes flicked toward her, calculating. The hospital director had not yet arrived, but the machinery of response was already turning. "Sharing that would violate policy," the woman said. "And patient privacy." "It would," Jesse agreed. "Unless it's used to report a civil rights violation, then it's protected." The corridor felt suddenly crowded. Nurses pretended not to listen while listening to everything. Zayden watched the exchange with a dawning understanding that this was another kind of emergency, one that didn't announce itself with sirens. "What happens now?" Zayden asked, his voice cutting through the legal language. The risk manager looked at him for the first time. Really looked, as if noticing a detail she'd previously edited out. "We're ensuring your brother receives appropriate care," she said carefully, "and we're reviewing what occurred earlier." Jesse caught the subtext. Review meant delay. Delay meant deniability. He weighed his options, and felt the choice settle into place with a calm he hadn't expected. He pulled out his phone, and without theatrics, opened the camera roll. He didn't show the images yet. He let the implication hang. "I don't want a review," he said. "I want accountability, and I want it now." The risk manager's jaw tightened. "You're threatening the hospital." "I'm protecting a kid," Jesse replied. "If those goals conflict, that's not on me." It worked. Not because the hospital suddenly found its conscience, but because it recognized a different kind of danger. Bad press. Christmas Eve headlines. The image of a black teenager turned away while snow piled up outside. The narrative could outrun the legal department before morning. Doors opened, orders were expedited. A supervisor appeared with reassurances that sounded practiced. Micah's treatment plan was adjusted and prioritized. Zayden was offered a chair, then a blanket. No one apologized, not yet, but the shift was unmistakable. As the immediate crisis stabilized, the consequences sharpened around Jesse. A security officer approached, polite but firm, and asked him to step aside. The risk manager followed, voice low, offering him a choice framed as courtesy. "We can handle this internally," she said. "You can leave your contact information and return to your family, or we can escalate." Jesse thought of his own family, of the quiet dinner waiting for him, of the years he had spent building a reputation that could evaporate overnight. He also thought of the alley, of Zayden's arms shaking as he held his brother, of how easily that image could have ended differently. "I'm not leaving," Jesse said. "Not until I know he's okay." The woman nodded once. The decision made for him. "Then we'll need to file an incident report." "Do it," Jesse said. The report was long and meticulous, its language carefully neutral. Jesse answered every question without embellishment. He described the refusal, the statement, the delay. He named names because the truth required specificity. With each word he felt the weight of his badge grow heavier, not as a burden, but as a measure of what it was supposed to mean. Across the hall, Zayden watched through the glass as Micah slept, oxygen steady, color slowly returning. Relief washed over him in waves, but it was threaded with a new fear. He understood now that survival came with strings, that help was often conditional, that even doing everything right could trigger scrutiny. A social worker appeared, clipboard in hand, her smile professional. She asked Zayden about school, about housing, about guardianship. The questions were framed as concern, but they landed like tests he hadn't studied for. He answered honestly, and honesty exposed the gaps the system loved to interrogate. Jesse noticed the interaction and felt his stomach sink. He recognized the pattern too. Medical crises had a way of inviting other authorities into the room, each with their own definitions of care. He caught the risk manager's eye again and spoke before the conversation could harden into something irreversible. "Be careful," he said quietly. "You're about to make this worse." The hospital director arrived then, breathless, coat still on. He listened to a brief summary, nodded at the right moments, and took control with practiced ease. He thanked Jesse for his concern, while reminding him of protocol. He assured Zayden that Micah was stable, while emphasizing the hospital's obligation to ensure a safe discharge plan. "And given the circumstances," the director added, voice smooth, "we'll need to involve Child Protective Services to assess the home environment." The words landed with a thud. Zayden felt the room tilt, the relief he'd been holding shatter into fear. CPS. He knew what that meant. Questions without context. Decisions without him. The possibility that doing the right thing, seeking help, would cost him the one thing he had left. Jesse took a step forward. "That's unnecessary," he said. "This family needs support, not surveillance." The director's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We're obligated reporters," he replied. "It's standard procedure." Standard, Jesse thought, was becoming a synonym for harm. He looked at Zayden, saw the panic he was trying to swallow, and understood the true shape of the choice in front of him. His career or this kid's future. His badge or his conscience. The hospital had relented on care, but it was tightening its grip elsewhere. Outside, Christmas lights glowed against the snow, a picture of warmth that felt cruel in its proximity. Inside, paperwork began to move with quiet efficiency, setting consequences into motion. As the director reaches for the phone, Jesse realizes the hospital isn't done, and neither is the system. As Child Protective Services is called for Zayden, the hallway that had only moments ago been filled with murmured reassurances and false comfort, now bristled with the quiet chaos of bureaucracy. The kind that didn't shout, didn't panic, but moved with the slow, confident tread of something that had already made up its mind. Zayden sat in a plastic chair outside room 12, his soaked hoodie still clinging to him in stiff patches, his legs trembling from cold and exhaustion. He watched through the small glass panel as Micah lay unconscious, tiny fingers curled beside his face, tethered to machines that buzzed and blinked in rhythm. The soft hiss of oxygen seemed louder than everything else. Then came the knock of low heels. Not rushed. Not frantic. Deliberate. Child Protective Services. The woman who stepped into the corridor looked out of place. Not because she didn't belong in a hospital, but because her presence brought a shift with it. The sharp, sterile scent of paperwork, protocols, and institutional indifference. Her name was Angela Frey, and her clipboard was already half filled before she even made eye contact with Zayden. He stood slowly, unsure whether to introduce himself or wait for her to speak. She didn't wait. "You're Zayden Cole?" He nodded. "Age? 16. Guardians?" "My aunt." "But she present?"
No.
"She's in North Carolina." Look, I can explain. Just let me." Angela held up a hand. "You don't have custody documents on file." "I wasn't carrying them. I didn't plan for this." Her gaze moved over his clothing. Torn jeans. Faded shoes. The dried streaks of salt and snow still staining his sleeves. No ID. No adult. No paperwork. She scribbled something. Zayden's voice cracked. "He's my brother." Angela barely looked up. "That doesn't change the protocol." She stepped aside, motioning for a second CPS worker. A younger man with a handheld scanner and a tablet. They didn't ask about Micah's condition. They didn't ask how long Zayden had carried his brother through the snow. They didn't ask why Mercy Grace had turned them away the first time. Instead, they asked if he'd ever been in the system before, if he had a phone, if he'd ever had behavioral issues in school. Zayden answered each one with growing disbelief, trying to steer the conversation back to the only thing that mattered. "My brother needs me," he said quietly. "He wakes up disoriented. He has seizures sometimes. He doesn't talk well after. I'm the only one who knows what calms him down." Angela didn't blink. "We're placing him under temporary medical custody. You'll be transported to a youth intake center until formal assessment is completed." "Wait. No. Please, just let me talk to the doctor. Jesse can vouch for me. He saw everything." Angela looked at the hospital director, who lingered near the nurse's station like an offstage conductor. He gave a small nod. Approval, not compassion. Covering liability. The worst part wasn't the injustice. It was how ordinary the whole process seemed to them. "I didn't do anything wrong," Zayden said, louder now. "I saved him. I brought him here when you all turned him away." Angela remained unmoved. "You also failed to provide documentation, emergency contacts, or verifiable housing. I didn't have time for any of that. I was trying to keep him alive. Emotional responses don't alter placement procedures." Zayden's hands curled into fists at his sides. Not to hit, not to lash out, but just to keep from shaking. His eyes darted to the room. He could see Micah through the window. Still asleep. Still alone. They weren't even going to let him say goodbye. Jesse stormed around the corner then, face tight, voice low but intense. "What the hell is going on?" Angela turned to him calmly. "We're following mandated reporting laws. The child is without documented guardianship, and the circumstances suggest neglect or endangerment." "Endangerment?" Jesse's voice cracked in disbelief. "He carried his unconscious brother 10 blocks in a snowstorm after your hospital turned them away. You are the danger here."
That's your opinion, Mr. McNair?
"Ours is that intervention is necessary. He's a child, not a case file." Jesse turned to the hospital director. "Stop this." But the man only folded his arms. "We've alerted CPS. It's out of our hands now." Angela motioned toward the elevator. "Let's go, Zayden." Zayden didn't move. His breath came hard, sharp. Everything inside him screamed to resist, to run, to fight, to punch through the glass, and reach his brother. But he knew what that would do. They would use it against him, prove them right, prove he was unstable. A threat, not a caretaker. He looked once more at Micah. Then, shoulders slumped, he stepped forward. As they led him away, he passed by the janitor, Travis Dorsey, an older man with silver-gray stubble and a mop in his hands, stood at the end of the hall pretending to clean a spill that didn't exist. His eyes, however, followed every word, every movement, every injustice. Zayden slowed just slightly as he passed and leaned in without looking. "They erased the footage," Zayden whispered, "but Jesse took photos. There's something wrong with this place." Travis didn't reply, but his mop paused for half a second. Enough for Zayden to know he'd been heard. Then the elevator doors opened, and Zayden disappeared inside. The moment the doors closed, Travis abandoned the mop. He walked calmly but with purpose, back down the corridor. Past room 12, past the triage station, past the monitors, and whiteboards, and whispers. He turned a corner, reached into his back pocket, and pulled out an old flip phone that most assumed didn't even work. He flipped it open with a practiced snap and dialed a number from memory. It rang once. "Yeah," he said. "It's me. Something's going down at Mercy Grace. We've got a kid being railroaded, and I've seen this kind of cover-up before. Time to dig." He hung up and slipped the phone away. Because Travis Dorsey wasn't just a janitor. Once, he'd been a whistleblower, a nurse, a fighter, until they pushed him out. But he was still listening, and now someone had just given him a reason to start digging again. Before Zayden is taken away, he whispers something to the janitor, and that janitor starts digging. The floor waxer hummed softly under fluorescent lights. But Travis Dorsey wasn't listening to the machine. He had long since mastered the art of moving unseen in spaces designed to overlook him. To the doctors, nurses, and administrators of Mercy Grace, he was just background noise. A mop, a bucket, a pair of worn orthopedic shoes squeaking on tile. He wore invisibility like armor, and tonight that armor became his greatest weapon. Travis had been a janitor at the hospital for 17 years. But long before that, before the back injury that ended his nursing career, before the war gave him medals and memories he never asked for, he had been something else. Observant, trained to assess without blinking, to hear things people didn't want said aloud, to notice when the narrative being told didn't match the truth leaking through the seams. And tonight, as he pushed his cart down the polished corridor outside the intake records office, he knew something stank worse than bleach. He hadn't needed to hear much from Zayden to know the boy was telling the truth. The way the kid whispered as he was led away, calm but urgent, was the same tone soldiers used before giving life-saving intel. No drama, just fact. They erased the footage. Jesse took photos. There's something wrong with this place. Travis had already known that. He'd seen too many black families turned away for lack of insurance or incomplete paperwork, while white walk-ins were waved through with a nod. He'd seen patients wait longer when they had the wrong zip code. He'd seen nurses like Marlene Whitaker hold power like a scalpel, cold, precise, and often bloodless in how they cut down those they didn't believe belonged. But he had never had evidence. Until now. He parked the waxer beside the maintenance closet, slipped inside, and closed the door. Inside the pocket of his coveralls was a keycard, old, deactivated years ago, when he was pushed out of active nursing for mobility issues, but still encoded with a digital signature that could get him into areas where cameras didn't always reach. A gift from a friend in IT. One of the last still left after the last round of quiet layoffs. He pulled it out now and stared at it for a beat before sliding it into the lock outside the intake records room. Green. The door clicked open. Inside, the room smelled like dust and toner. Filing cabinets lined the walls like soldiers at attention. In the corner, a monitor blinked to life as he approached. Travis sat down, his knees stiff, and cracked his fingers before pulling the keyboard close. His hands remembered more than the rest of him. How to type, how to search, how to dig without leaving a trail. He started with Zayden's intake record. It was there, time-stamped, incomplete, and flagged for referral. What caught his eye wasn't the entry itself, but the language used. Unaccompanied minor. No visible injuries upon arrival. Claims respiratory distress in sibling. Unverified. That word, claims, sent a chill through him. Medical staff weren't supposed to write that way. They were trained to use reports or presence with symptoms. Claims implied deception, doubt, and it wasn't the first time he'd seen it. He pulled up the audit log for the last 6 months. Typed in keywords: black, minor refusal, left without treatment, no ID. The list that appeared was longer than it should have been. He scrolled, line after line. Uninsured black patients marked non-compliant. Parents whose children were tagged agitated or uncooperative. Teenagers listed as suspicious loiterers, even when presenting with symptoms. A few had been logged as having left against medical advice, even though their records showed no doctor had seen them. One entry stuck out. A woman named Shanice Mayers, brought in with abdominal pain, turned away due to a clerical mismatch. She had died 2 days later from a ruptured appendix at another hospital. Another was a boy named Tariq Holt, 15, flagged for disruptive behavior after arriving with a deep gash on his arm from a bike accident. His notes mentioned poor hygiene, a coded term Travis had learned to read between. He clicked through 3 more, 5, 10, each with tiny bureaucratic fingerprints of racial bias buried in procedural language. Enough to excuse, enough to forget, but he kept digging. At the bottom of the archived reports folder was a locked directory labeled high-risk triage exceptions. It required credentials beyond his old badge. Travis leaned back in the chair, rubbing his jaw. He had seen this kind of hiding before. During his nurse years, some hospitals used folders like that to flag patients who presented risk to staff morale, an HR euphemism for people who make white staff uncomfortable. It was unofficial, It was unethical, and it was exactly the kind of thing that a hospital like Mercy Grace, desperate to tote its image, would quietly condone. He pulled out his phone and dialed the same number from earlier. This time, when the voice answered, he didn't wait. "You still got that access tool you built back in 21? He asked. "The one for emergency backups?" The man on the other end paused. "You know that's not legal, Travis. They're about to bury a kid for being black and poor," Travis replied. "You gonna help or keep preaching?" There was a long silence, then a series of clicks. His screen blinked. The locked folder opened. Inside were only 5 documents, but they were damning. Each one detailed a triage denial involving black patients under the age of 18. One, dated just weeks ago, described deliberate triage rerouting for youth flagged as non-verifiable or high liability. The language was clinical, hidden under legal doublespeak, but Travis understood it perfectly. It was a list of kids Mercy Grace had quietly decided weren't worth the risk. Zayden's name was now among them. Travis leaned back, rage simmering in his chest. They hadn't just made a mistake, they'd made a habit of it. He printed the documents quickly, folded them into a thick envelope, and slid them into his supply cart, under a stack of mop heads. His hands shook, not from fear, but from knowing that what he held wasn't just proof. It was ammunition. He exited the room and closed the door behind him, careful to wipe the knob clean. As he pushed the cart back down the corridor, he passed Marlene at the nurse's station. She didn't look up, didn't notice him, but he noticed her. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something he'd buried deep beneath resignation. As he passed a reflective panel near the ER entrance, he caught his own face. Older, worn, half-shadowed in the blue cast of lockdown lights. For too long he had let them pretend he was just the janitor. But tonight, they'd remember who he really was. Travis finds a hidden document showing the hospital denied aid to multiple black patients this year, all covered up. The storm outside had dulled into a quiet flurry by dawn, but inside Mercy Grace Hospital, the storm was only beginning to build. While fluorescent lights painted every surface in sterile calm, Travis Dorsey moved through the halls with purpose, the stolen documents buried beneath mop heads in his cart like secrets wrapped in linen. He had spent the night watching, waiting, listening to conversations that weren't meant for ears like his. Marlene's clipped voice, the risk manager's coded deflections, even the younger nurses whispering about another one flagged. The pattern was too clean to ignore, too rehearsed to be coincidence. Across the hospital, Jesse McNair sat in a break room he no longer had permission to use, his paramedic jacket draped over a folding chair, his phone charging in the wall socket. On the table sat a manila envelope. Travis had slid to him without a word. Jesse's fingers trembled as he flipped through the contents. Intake logs, refusal records, internal communications flagged as non-urgent when the patients listed were disproportionately black or Latino. "What am I looking at?" Jesse asked under his breath. Travis leaned against the doorframe, his mop resting beside him. Policy without the name. Protocol that never gets printed but always gets followed. "You are looking at the difference between who gets saved and who gets shuffled." Jesse closed the folder slowly. "They won't survive this if it gets out." "They're not supposed to," Travis replied. "They're supposed to survive you not finding it." The pieces were falling into place now. Mercy Grace hadn't just failed to care for certain patients. They had built an ecosystem around justifying that failure. The documents detailed an internal alert code system that labeled certain patients as triage optional. A nurse could mark the patient as delayed intake if they had no insurance, an address from a flagged zip code, or unverified family support. All of it couched in legal-sounding terms, no race listed, but the names told a story no spreadsheet could disguise. And at the center of this quiet algorithm was Marlene Whitaker. Jesse didn't need to ask Travis how he'd gotten the files. He understood the risks, the silence it had taken, the doors passed through unnoticed. But even as the truth formed in his hands, a new urgency tore through his thoughts like a wire fraying mid-voltage. Micah. The boy was in surgery now, and no one was asking the right questions. Jesse shot to his feet. "Where is Zayden?" "Locked in temporary holding," Travis said flatly. "CPS isn't letting him near the floor. Claims it'll disrupt the medical team." Jesse's mouth tightened. "And the medical team? Do they even know about his allergy?" "They've got a partial file," Travis said, "but they're working off an old diagnosis. RSV. Not asthma. Not anaphylaxis history." Jesse grabbed his jacket and started toward the elevators. Zayden sat in a folding chair inside a beige windowless room at the CPS intake facility downtown. A nurse's aide watching him through thick-rimmed glasses, like he was a shoplifter waiting for the cops. No TV, no clock, no phone, no way of knowing what time it was, or whether Micah was still breathing. His legs bounced beneath him. Nerves, adrenaline, and the crushing weight of being helpless. The moment they took him from the hospital, everything had slowed. The intake process, the questions, the thin blanket and the cold sandwich. But his mind didn't slow. It kept spinning, rewinding, obsessing over every detail, especially one. He closed his eyes and replayed the moment before they took him away. The nurse had been talking to a doctor outside Micah's room. Zayden had only caught pieces of the conversation, but one phrase repeated in his head like a warning siren. Standard antibiotic drip. Begin with ceftriaxone. He opened his eyes. No, he whispered. He stood up. No, no, no. The nurse's aide looked up. Sit down. They're giving him the wrong medication, Zayden said, his voice rising. They're giving him something he's allergic to. You need to sit down. No, you don't understand. Micah had a reaction to ceftriaxone before. He swelled up, his throat closed. He had to go to the ER. They switched him to azithromycin. Sir, he has a known allergy, and they're giving it to him because they didn't listen. Because I'm not there to tell them. The aide reached for the intercom, calling for security. Zayden backed toward the wall, breath ragged. He couldn't let them sedate him, couldn't let them write him off as another angry teen acting out. He pressed his palms against his head, trying to calm down, but the panic was real, and it was getting louder. That's when the door burst open. Jesse, breathless, furious. I need him now, he snapped at the startled aide. He's the only one who knows Micah's full history. You're not on file. I'm on camera, helping this hospital fix your mistake. Get the director. The aide hesitated. Jesse stepped past her and crouched in front of Zayden. What medication did you say? Ceftriaxone. You're sure? I watched him get hives and choke on it when he was 9. Jesse nodded. I believe you. Within seconds, he was dialing the ER, not the main line. He used the personal number of a nurse who owed him. He relayed the info, demanded they halt the drip, and then made the call again to the surgical floor. By the time they reached the hospital 20 minutes later, a new alert had been triggered. Code Red, medication allergy alert. In room 9, chaos had unfolded just minutes before. A surgical assistant had noticed unusual swelling around Micah's neck. At first, they thought it was the result of intubation. Then the rash spread. A nurse shouted for an EpiKit. The surgeon paused, voice calm but tight. An emergency override on the IV pump was hit. Seconds after Jesse and Zayden arrived back on the floor, alarms still buzzed in the background. They weren't too late, but they were close. A senior nurse explained in hushed tones that the medication had indeed triggered an allergic response. He was prepped based on a generalized respiratory profile, she admitted, not the notes in his supplemental chart. Zayden didn't say I told you so. He didn't have to. His silence, his eyes locked on Micah's unconscious body, spoke volumes. Jesse stood beside him, fists clenched, jaw tight. He wasn't looking at the nurses or the surgeons anymore. He was looking at Marlene Whitaker, who had just entered the corridor holding a tablet, pretending to review schedules, avoiding everyone's gaze but tracking everything like a hawk. You almost killed him, Zayden said softly. Marlene didn't flinch, but something in her posture shifted. We followed the initial chart, she said coldly. The error came from the intake. Travis stepped forward, holding the envelope of documents in his hand like a judge delivering sentence. You mean the intake you flagged, Marlene? Or the allergy you ignored? Because the boy who told you wasn't wearing the right shoes. The corridor went silent. Other staff turned, phones paused. The moment cracked open like a wound, and for the first time, Marlene couldn't hide behind her clipboard or her sterile professionalism. The illusion of care had broken. Zayden's voice trembled as he asked the one question that finally turned heads. How many more kids died because someone like me wasn't allowed to speak? In a twist, it's Zayden, not the doctors, who realizes Micah is allergic to the medication they're giving him. The corridor outside the operating wing felt colder than the rest of the hospital, as if the air itself knew the stakes had changed. Zayden stood there with Jesse and Travis, the aftershock of the near miss still vibrating through his bones. The alarms had quieted, but the truth they revealed refused to settle. Micah lay beyond the double doors now, prepped and sedated, the surgery advancing on a path that assumed the past had already been accounted for. Zayden knew better. He had known better since the moment he heard the drug name whispered like routine. It wasn't luck. It wasn't instinct. It was memory. Years earlier, before the streets hardened him, before winter nights taught him how to keep moving when the world told him to stop, Zayden had spent afternoons trailing his aunt through a community clinic in Durham. She was a nurse practitioner who worked too many hours and laughed too loud in the break room. The kind of clinician who learned names and noticed patterns. She had let him sit in the corner with a spiral notebook while she explained why one medication calmed inflammation, but strangled airways in certain bodies. Why charts mattered less than listening. Why allergies weren't footnotes but red flags. Zayden hadn't known he was studying. He had just been present. Absorbing. Filing details away like survival tools. He remembered the poster on the clinic wall, with antibiotics listed in neat columns. He remembered his aunt tapping a name with her pen and saying, almost casually, "This one saves lives, but not for everyone." He remembered Micah at 9 years old, small and scared, breaking out in hives as the room erupted in panic, the nurse shouting for epinephrine while his aunt pushed through the crowd and took control. He remembered the word that mattered most because it had almost killed his brother. Now that word echoed again, and the echo grew louder with every step the surgical team took without him. Zayden moved toward the doors. A nurse intercepted him gently at first. Palm up, voice soft with professional patience. "You can't go in there. I need to tell them something," Zayden said, keeping his voice steady. "They're using the wrong medication. I already told." "We have it under control," the nurse replied, eyes flicking toward Jessie as if to reassure herself. "The surgeons are aware of the allergy." Zayden shook his head. "They're aware of an allergy, not the one that matters." Behind him, Jessie felt the familiar frustration rise again. The sense of shouting into a system trained to mistake calm authority for correctness. He leaned forward, backing Zayden's words with his presence. "He caught the first mistake," Jessie said. "Listen to him." The nurse hesitated, then stepped aside to make a call. Zayden didn't wait. He pushed toward the doors just as they swung open and Marlene Whitaker appeared, tablet in hand, expression set like concrete. She took in the scene quickly. The boy too close to restricted space, the paramedic too involved, the janitor too near, and decided to end it. "That's far enough," Marlene said, voice sharp, carrying the weight of her title. "You've caused enough disruption tonight." Zayden met her gaze. His fear sharpened into clarity. "They're using ceftriaxone," he said. "He can't have it. It triggers anaphylaxis for him. You saw the reaction start. If they continue..." Marlene cut him off with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We corrected the drip," she said. "The situation is stable." "It's not," Zayden insisted. "It's in his chart from years ago. It's not flagged because you didn't provide proper documentation." Marlene snapped, the old refrain returning like muscle memory. "You don't get to run this hospital because you watched a nurse once." The word stung more than she intended, and everyone felt it. Jessie's jaw tightened. Travis's shoulders squared. Zayden inhaled slowly, forcing himself not to flinch, not to give her the satisfaction of dismissal. "I watched my brother almost die," Zayden said quietly, "and I learned what to look for." Marlene turned to the nurse behind her. "Call security." The call went out with practiced efficiency. Zayden felt the shift immediately. The way authority summoned reinforcement. The way the room's tone changed from consideration to control. He took another step forward anyway, desperation threading through his calm. "Please," he said, not to Marlene now, but to the people listening. "Just tell them to switch to azithromycin. Just pause and check." The doors behind Marlene remained closed. The operating wing hummed, indifferent. The idea that something irreversible was unfolding beyond those walls pressed down on Zayden's chest until breathing felt like work. Security arrived in pairs, uniforms crisp, expressions neutral. One of them spoke, voice rehearsed. "Sir, you need to step back." "I'm not leaving," Zayden replied. His hands were open, his stance non-threatening, but his resolve was unmistakable. "Not until you tell them." Marlene's eyes flashed. "Escort him out." The guards moved closer, not rough but firm, hands reaching for Zayden's arms. The contact was brief, procedural, but it sent a surge of helplessness through him. He twisted just enough to keep his voice aimed at the doors. "Stop the drip," he shouted. "Check the allergy history from Duke Community Clinic. 2016. Ask Dr. Morales." The name hung in the air like a lifeline thrown into darkness. Inside the operating room, a monitor beeped irregularly. At first it was subtle, a blip that didn't match the rhythm. A nurse glanced up, frowned, adjusted a setting. Then Micah's body reacted, the signs unmistakable to anyone who knew what they meant. Swelling. A rash spreading too quickly to be coincidence. The anesthesiologist's voice sharpened as he called out changes, the calm of routine giving way to urgency. Outside, Zayden felt it before he heard it, a cold certainty blooming in his gut. Wait, he said, voice cracking now. He's reacting. Marlene turned sharply as an alarm sounded from behind the doors. Short, insistent, wrong. The surgical team's voices overlapped, no longer measured. A nurse burst out to grab supplies, eyes wide. Epi. Now. Someone called from inside. The guards froze, hands still on Zayden's sleeves, the sudden shift disrupting the script they were following. Jesse surged forward, anger and fear colliding. Let him go, he demanded. He was right. Marlene stood rooted, the tablet slipping in her grasp. The certainty she had built her authority on cracked audibly, the sound drowned out by the escalating alarms. For a split second she saw Lily again, not as a memory she could weaponize, but as a life that had needed someone to pause and listen. Zayden wrenched free as the guards loosened their grip. Not fighting them, just moving with the momentum of truth finally recognized. He didn't reach the doors. He didn't need to. The damage had already been named. The response was underway. Inside the operating room, Micah seized violently. The word tore through the corridor, followed by orders barked and overridden, protocols rewritten in real time by necessity. A senior surgeon shouted for the medication change. The anesthesiologist adjusted. The epi was administered. The room filled with the controlled chaos of a team racing to undo what certainty had almost finished. Zayden stood shaking, tears streaking down his face, helpless again but no longer unheard. Jesse's hand landed on his shoulder, steadying him. Travis watched Marlene, who stared at the closed doors with a face stripped of armor, the cost of her assumptions finally undeniable. Minutes stretched into something elastic and cruel. When the alarms began to normalize, when the frantic cadence slowed, a nurse emerged, breathless but composed enough to speak. He's stabilized, she said. We caught it. Zayden sagged, relief crashing into him so hard his knees buckled. Jesse held him up. Across the hall, Marlene swallowed, the word almost echoing in her head with a weight she could not shed. The doors closed again, sealing Micah inside with a future that had nearly been stolen. And in the quiet that followed, Zayden realized something else, something that cut deeper than fear. Being right had not been enough. He had only been heard when disaster forced the system's hand. As security finally lets go and the alarms fade, Zayden understands that Micah survived, but the truth about why he almost didn't is about to explode beyond the operating room. The corridor turned into something primal. The white lights, once indifferent and cold, now flashed red in tandem with the sharp, mechanical voice from the overhead speaker. Code Blue. Operating Room 9. Code Blue. Time fractured. Nurses who had stood still moments earlier now broke into motion. Carts rolled out of side rooms. Defibrillator pads were called for, and the runner peeled off toward the crash kit locker. Conversation stopped mid-word, mid-sentence. The rhythm of the hospital changed from bureaucracy to crisis mode in seconds. But Zayden's voice was the first to break through the noise. He's allergic to ceftriaxone. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't panic. It was a scream torn from the place where memory and desperation meet. The syllables hit the walls like warning shots. Security froze mid-grip. One guard still had his hand near Zayden's arm, but didn't complete the motion. The whole hall had stopped breathing. Across the hall, a resident no older than 25, nervous-looking, stethoscope crooked around his neck, was halfway to the OR doors when the words reached him. He turned. What did you say? Ceftriaxone. He's allergic. That's what's shutting him down. Zayden's chest was heaving, but his voice was pure fire now. They're using the wrong drug. It's not in the main file. He needs azithromycin. Not that. The resident didn't wait. He pushed through the OR doors without asking permission, without clarifying protocol. And for that decision alone, a boy was about to live. Inside, the surgeons were already scrambling. Micah had begun convulsing, his vitals plunging into a freefall. Swelling under the skin, airway constriction. Two nurses were preparing a tracheal tube. The anesthesiologist called out for suction. The lead surgeon shouted for someone to override the dosage input on the IV pump. It wasn't an accident. It was an assumption that had spiraled into emergency. The resident burst into the room, words flying out. Allergy alert. Ceftriaxone. Switch immediately. Patient history confirms anaphylaxis. The surgical nurse paused. There's no record in. Check the 2016 supplemental file from Duke Community Clinic. His brother just ID'd it. And he's right. The team didn't hesitate now. The drip was stopped. An alternative antibiotic was prepped. A nurse administered epinephrine with shaking hands. Another adjusted the intubation angle. Micah twitched once more, then slumped. For a second, everything paused. Then the oxygen levels began to rise, and with it the weight in the room shifted. Micah's vitals stabilized. The lead surgeon exhaled through his mask. Keep monitoring. That was too close. On the other side of the doors, Zayden stood frozen in place, sweat cold on his neck. Jesse beside him gripping the edge of a chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Travis had his arms crossed, his expression hard as concrete. And Marlene? She stood nearest the glass. She had heard every word. Her mouth parted slightly, as if some half-hearted justification had tried to form and failed, in the face of facts. Her hands clenched the clipboard so tight the plastic creaked. Her eyes were fixed on the room, watching what her decisions had nearly cost. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't protocol. This was racism at the edge of a scalpel. And now the hospital was scrambling to shield itself. In a private office 2 floors above, the hospital's in-house legal team had gathered like a war council. One woman stood at the monitor station, fast-forwarding through surveillance footage with a precision that felt surgical in its own right. Each clip, each angle, Zayden in the ER, Jesse arguing with the risk manager, the moment Marlene dismissed the boys, the approach of security, all of it catalogued. Start with the ER entrance cam, one lawyer said. Scrub anything from earlier tonight that shows the denial. But the system backs up to the cloud. We'll control the upload. This needs to be offline by morning. They moved with the speed of people who had done this before. It was never spoken aloud, but everyone understood the goal. Minimize liability. Frame the chaos as an unfortunate anomaly. Isolate the mistake as a rare miscommunication. Protect the brand of mercy grace. Footage was marked. Files were renamed. Only no one noticed the backup server already active on a hidden line. At the bottom level of the hospital, in a utility closet disguised as a linen room, Travis stood in front of an old laptop connected to a private drive.
The laptop wasn't new, the cable jerry-rigged, but the feed was clean.
A small blinking light confirmed what he needed to know. He had it.
The footage, the audio, the moments they were already trying to erase.
Zayden begging for help. Marlene saying, "We don't treat street kids." The denial, the hesitation, the panic, the proof. He clicked through each file slowly, hands steady. His jaw clenched tighter with every scene, but he didn't let emotion break his rhythm. He'd waited years for a moment like this. Not for revenge, but for truth. The world never believed stories like Zayden's, unless they were captured, archived, sharpened into undeniable documentation. This time, there would be no spinning, no quiet deletion. This time, they were caught. Travis closed the laptop, tucked it into his janitor's cart beneath a stack of towels, and rolled out of the room like any other worker, ending his shift. But he wasn't ending anything. He was just beginning. Back upstairs, the hospital had regained its rhythm. Alarms had dimmed. The hallway buzzed with the hum of normalcy returning. Zayden stood alone at the window, watching his brother sleep in post-op recovery, IV line still in place, lips slightly parted in the haze of sedation. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe. But the relief didn't come clean. It was wrapped in grief, not for a death, but for a truth that had finally shown itself in full light. They hadn't just ignored him. They had chosen to, and they almost succeeded. Jesse walked over and placed a quiet hand on Zayden's shoulder. "You saved him," he said softly. Zayden didn't smile. His eyes were too full of what he had seen. "I shouldn't have had to." Behind them, Marlene stood at the nurse's station, watching the boy she once dismissed now standing in the light of vindication. For the first time in her career, she didn't know how to hide, but hiding wouldn't help her now, because someone was already pulling the curtain back. The hospital's legal team begins erasing surveillance footage, but someone already made a copy. The hospital tried to return to normal. They scrubbed the walls, silenced alarms, reassigned schedules, and handed out tired smiles like bandages. But what had happened in Operating Room 9 didn't fade with a shift change. It lingered in the air, not like a memory, but like an infection. A wound Mercy Grace couldn't hide anymore. The legal team worked overnight to bury it, The administrators drafted statements laced with soft language, standard procedures, unfortunate timing, complex triage decisions. But words on a press release couldn't erase the image of Zayden being restrained while screaming to save his brother's life. They couldn't cover up the fact that the only reason Micah was alive was because his teenage brother, not the trained staff, had remembered an allergy the system ignored. And then the footage got out. Not from Travis, not even from Zayden, but from Jesse. It was the final straw. He sat alone in his one-bedroom apartment that overlooked a street where snow still clung to the gutters. His badge sat on the kitchen table beside a takeout box he hadn't touched. The weight of the hospital's silence had followed him home, and it pressed harder than any official reprimand. They hadn't suspended him yet. They were waiting for the dust to settle, hoping he'd walk away quietly. But Jesse McNair had seen enough to know silence wasn't protection. It was complicity. He opened the file Travis had handed him. It included everything. The intake refusals, the triage optional flags, the suppressed allergy note, and the internal memo suggesting a behavioral evaluation be added to Zayden's chart, a coded attempt to brand the boy as volatile before public scrutiny arrived. Jesse didn't contact a lawyer. He called Marla Dean, a tenacious anchor at Channel 12 News, known for exposing a police scandal 2 years earlier. She had the kind of reach the hospital feared, and the integrity Jesse trusted. "Jesse," she answered, curious. "I'm assuming this isn't a social call. You ever wanted proof of what systemic racism looks like in healthcare?" he asked. He didn't need to say more. An hour later, they met in a dimly lit parking garage near the station. Jesse handed her the USB drive, and one sentence: "Run it exactly as it is. No edits. People need to see it raw." Marla nodded, her expression tight. She'd seen a lot in her career, but as she watched the footage, Zayden's desperate cries, Marlene's voice calling him a street kid, the moment security dragged him away, even she went silent. The story aired 18 hours later. Headline: Black teen saves brother after racist nurse denies him emergency care. Exclusive Mercy Grace footage. The impact was immediate. It started online. Twitter, TikTok, Facebook. The footage spread like a match across dry leaves. Screenshots of Marlene's face mid-sneer. Hashtags done justice for Zayden. Mercy Grace cover-up. System failed him. The most shared clip showed Zayden yelling the allergy at the top of his lungs while security restrained him. Within 6 hours, it had over 4 million views. By morning, the first protesters arrived. They gathered outside the ER entrance, holding signs soaked with slush and anger. "We deserve care, street kids bleed too. Maybe if he was white." The hospital's front doors were barricaded with a line of private security by noon. Police were called, but no arrests were made. They didn't want to pour gas on an already spreading fire. Inside, staff whispered in corners. Some nurses turned their badges inward, ashamed. A few openly supported Marlene, claiming the video was edited or taken out of context. But most knew the truth. The camera didn't lie. It just captured what too many had normalized. Marlene didn't speak to the press. She took administrative leave, citing stress. She didn't deny the statement. She claimed she didn't recall it happening. Her silence, however, was louder than any denial. The hospital's official statement landed that afternoon. "We are deeply troubled by the events shown. While this incident is being reviewed, we urge the public to understand the complexity of emergency triage. We regret any miscommunication and remain committed to equitable care for all." Miscommunication. The word sparked a second wave of fury. Marla Dean's inbox exploded with messages. Former patients, ex-staff members, anonymous tips. One nurse said she had been told to defer all non-urgent walk-ins, without insurance. Another shared that she once flagged a child as critical, only for Marlene to override it with a social context downgrade. But the twist no one expected came the next morning. A new message landed in Marla's inbox. Subject line: "She's my aunt and she's been doing this for years." Attached was a voice memo. It began with a trembling breath. "My name is Reese Whitaker. I'm a nursing student. Marlene Whitaker is my aunt, and I need to tell you what she's done." The voice was young, steady, and unmistakably scared. "She's been saying things like this for years. Not just once, not just that boy. She always talked about those kinds of patients. She'd come home complaining about entitled kids from the East Side, or mothers with 6 kids and no fathers. She once said it'd be easier if the hospital could just filter who came through the doors." Marla leaned forward, heart racing. "I didn't say anything. I didn't want to lose my spot in the program. But after seeing what she did to that boy, to Zayden, I can't be quiet anymore." The message ended with a sob. And just like that, The hospital had a whistleblower. Not an outsider, not an angry patient, but Marlene's own blood. The story took a darker turn. News outlets across the country picked it up. NBC headline: Nurse's family member confirms long-term racist remarks amid Mercy Grace scandal. BuzzFeed: she called him a street kid. Now her niece is speaking out. Washington Post: medical bias in emergency care. The Mercy Grace fallout. Inside Mercy Grace, panic set in. Administrators began reviewing years of patient logs. Lawyers huddled in windowless rooms, drafting apologies that wouldn't be enough. PR consultants urged Marlene to release a statement. She refused. Zayden, still staying with Jesse during Micah's recovery, watched the news in silence. He didn't celebrate. He didn't cry. He just stared, knowing the world had finally seen the pain he carried for so long. Pain that wasn't his alone, but woven through generations. I didn't think anyone would believe me, he said quietly. They didn't, Jesse replied. They believed the tape, Zayden nodded. But now they can't look away.
And he was right.
Because the world was watching now. And someone else, someone buried in the records, someone forgotten like he almost had been, was about to come forward. The whistleblower is Nurse Marlene's own niece. For the first time in decades, Mercy Grace Hospital's gleaming white facade had become a symbol not of healing, but of harm. The public no longer saw a sanctuary for the sick. They saw a battleground for justice. A building wrapped in scandal, its walls stained not with blood but bias. The footage had cracked the surface, but it was the voice of Reese Whitaker, Marlene's own niece, that shattered it. Within 24 hours of the leaked voicemail, Channel 12 News aired the full segment. Reese didn't just speak. She provided receipts, screenshots of private family group chats, where Marlene had referred to black patients as problem breeds, liabilities, and most damning of all, unsalvageable cases. There were emails too cold, clean and official, where she'd advocated for a priority pathway for insured patients and delayed intake for minors without documentation. The language was careful, but the intention screamed. The media pounced. CNN headline: Racist triage? Nurse's family confirms long-standing pattern at Mercy Grace. Vice News: exclusive screenshots reveal shocking bias inside hospital walls. Rolling Stone: not just one boy, the quiet discrimination that almost killed Zayden's brother. But it wasn't just the news cycle that moved fast. The consequences did too. By noon the next day, 3 major sponsors pulled their funding from Mercy Grace. One of the hospital's biggest donors, a local philanthropist known for supporting urban youth programs, released a blistering statement: "We will not support any institution that quietly endangers the very communities it claims to serve." Civil rights attorneys filed notice of a class action lawsuit representing former patients of color who believed they had been discriminated against or denied care. The hospital board met behind closed doors for hours, flanked by lawyers and public relations executives, all speaking in damage control tongues. And at the center of the storm, Marlene Whitaker stood unflinching. She didn't resign. She didn't apologize. She took administrative leave, a phrase so polished it practically sparkled on paper, but everyone knew it meant one thing: she was being shoved out quietly. A soft exile in hopes the flames would die down. But Marlene refused to go quietly. She wasn't finished. Not in her mind. In a brief but explosive interview requested by a sympathetic local paper, Marlene spoke for herself. Her tone was clinical. Her gaze cold. "I did what I thought was necessary," she said. "Hospitals can't afford to waste resources on cases that are going nowhere. That boy, Zayden, he got lucky. That's all. And luck shouldn't become a policy." The journalist blinked. "You're saying his brother surviving was luck?" "I'm saying," Marlene replied slowly, "that we can't let emotion override triage protocol. Otherwise, we'll spend all our time babysitting kids who run into hospitals screaming every time their sibling catches a cold." It was the quote heard around the world. He got lucky, and luck shouldn't become a policy. That line flooded timelines. It became a meme, a protest chant, a battle cry. In front of Mercy Grace, picketers held signs that read, "We're not lucky, we're human." Across the country, nurses and doctors condemned her stance. Some organized under a hashtag, "Not in my hospital," but inside Marlene's condo, nestled in a quiet gated community far from the storm she'd started, she remained strangely unmoved. She watched the coverage alone, blinds drawn, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, as the world tore her legacy to shreds. She didn't weep. She didn't rant. She sat still, the glow of the TV casting her face in harsh light. What troubled her wasn't the footage. It wasn't even the media frenzy. It was Reese. The betrayal gnawed at her. Not because she felt guilty. She didn't. But because the girl she once babysat, the shy one who sat at her table every Thanksgiving, had turned her in. Blood had folded under pressure. Loyalty had snapped. And Marlene couldn't understand why. She had always taught Reese to be strong, to follow rules, to understand how the world really worked, that not everyone could be saved, that some lives cost more than others. It wasn't cruelty, she believed. It was math. Resources. Reality. She'd watched too many people pretend like healthcare was infinite. But she had seen the budget sheets, the patient flow data, the readmittance rates. She'd lived in the pressure of medical burnout for years. Somewhere along the line, the edges blurred. Choices became judgment, and people became probabilities. But none of that seemed to matter now. They wanted her to say the right words. Cry on camera. Beg for forgiveness. Marlene had no intention of doing any of that, because in her mind she hadn't failed. She'd simply been caught in a world that suddenly decided to care too late. But then the doorbell rang. Not the press. Not the board. Someone else. Marlene crossed the living room slowly, robe wrapped tight, and peered through the peephole. She froze. Standing on her porch, wrapped in a brown trench coat with a battered fedora and eyes she hadn't seen in years, was her father, Judge Everett Whitaker, retired circuit court judge, decorated World War II vet, one of the first black attorneys to argue for desegregation in Maryland public schools, and the man who had once told her, when she was just a teenager with dreams of medical school, "No title is worth having if you forget the people you came from." She hadn't spoken to him in nearly a year. Now he stood quietly on her porch, waiting. Marlene opened the door, voice catching. "Dad." He looked at her for a long, heavy second before speaking. "I saw the interview." She stepped aside, trying to gather herself. "I didn't mean, you said that boy was lucky." He interrupted. His tone was not angry. Not loud, but sharp in a way that made her feel 16 again. Sitting on their living room floor, caught in a lie. "I meant in terms of outcome," she said defensively. "The system isn't perfect. You know that. You were a judge. I've seen injustice dressed up as order," he said, walking past her into the house. "I've seen systems that punish truth and reward cruelty, and I've spent my life trying to make sure people like you didn't fall into that trap." She shut the door behind him slowly, her spine straightening. "You don't know what it's like to work in medicine today." "No," he said, turning to face her fully now. "But I know what it means to forget who you're working for." She tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. He walked past her to the living room, eyes scanning the stacks of press clippings and discarded emails on the table. The mess of a life unraveling under scrutiny. Then he looked back at her. "I raised you better than this, Marlene." Her shoulders dropped. He wasn't here to save her. He was here to remind her that she'd become the kind of person he had fought his whole life to stop. Marlene's own father sees the news and decides to pay her a visit. Earl Whitaker did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The weight of his words had always done the work for him. The way a gavel silences a room before it ever strikes. He stood in Marlene's living room, coat still on, hat resting on the table like a relic from another era, and looked at the woman she had become with an expression that was neither rage nor pity. It was something colder, disappointment sharpened by history. "I marched for this country to see my daughter stand on the right side of it," Earl said at last, his voice steady. "Not to watch her explain away cruelty like it's a scheduling error." Marlene crossed her arms, defensive instincts kicking in. "You're letting the media twist this," she said. "You know how narratives work. They cut context. They don't understand medicine." Earl's eyes flicked to the muted television, where her face was frozen mid-sentence beneath the headline that had followed her everywhere. "He got lucky." "I understand systems," he replied. "I understand how language protects power. I spent 40 years pulling those threads apart in courtrooms that didn't want to hear it." He moved toward the window, looking out at a street lined with winter bare trees. "When I was your age, your mother and I took you with us to Selma. You were 6. You held my hand so tight I thought you'd cut off circulation. You asked me why people were shouting at us. I told you because they were afraid of a world where they didn't get to decide who mattered." Marlene's jaw tightened. She remembered the march. The heat, the way her mother sang under her breath to keep her calm. She remembered feeling proud, even then, without fully understanding why. "That was different," she said. "This is healthcare. It's not ideology, it's logistics." Earl turned back to her. Logistics are where ideology hides when it's ashamed of itself. He picked up his hat, ran a thumb along the brim. You think I didn't see what you were doing? I saw the way you talked about patience at Thanksgiving. The jokes dressed up as stress. The shortcuts framed as efficiency. I told myself it was burnout. I told myself you'd remember who you were. Marlene's voice wavered. Just slightly. I did what I thought was necessary. That's what every unjust system says. Earl replied. Necessary for whom? The knock came then, sharp and insistent. Marlene flinched. Earl didn't. He walked to the door and opened it without asking. Cameras flooded the threshold. Lights snapping on. A reporter already mid-sentence. The world eager for another soundbite. Judge Whitaker. The reporter said, surprised. Do you have a statement about your daughter's role in... Earl stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him so Marlene could hear but not intervene. The cold air didn't bother him. He faced the cameras like an old friend he no longer trusted. I do, he said. The microphones surged closer. I raised my daughter to believe that dignity is not conditional. Earl continued. That institutions exist to serve people, not sort them. What I saw in that footage was not a mistake. It was a habit, and I will not defend it. Inside, Marlene felt the floor tilt. Dad, she said, opening the door, but it was too late. The words were already moving, already becoming history. I do not recognize the values on display as the values of my family, Earl said, and I will not lend my name to excuse them. The reporter hesitated. Are you disowning your daughter? Earl paused, the silence heavy enough to bruise. I am withdrawing my protection, he said carefully. She is an adult. She will answer for her choices like anyone else. The clip went live within minutes. Across the city, phones buzzed. Social feeds exploded. The image of a revered civil rights lawyer publicly severing himself from his daughter's actions became a symbol too potent to contain. Supporters of Mercy Grace fell silent. Sponsors released follow-up statements. Politicians weighed in, careful but firm. Inside the hospital, the board convened an emergency session. The room was windowless. The table polished to a reflective sheen that showed every face twice, once as it was, once as it wished it could be. Files were stacked. Legal counsel spoke in low tones. The words liability, precedent, and irreparable harm floated like smoke. This is no longer manageable, the board chair said. The father's statement changed the calculus. A member leaned forward. If we terminate her, we admit fault. Another shook his head. If we don't, we invite oversight. Federal oversight. The general counsel cleared her throat. There's also the whistleblower packet. It corroborates the pattern. If this goes to trial, the chair raised a hand. We need to decide tonight. Down the hall, Marlene sat alone in a small conference room, hands folded in her lap, the weight of her father's words pressing in. She replayed the porch scene again and again, not because she doubted what he'd said, but because she couldn't reconcile it with the man she knew, the man who had taught her to be strong, the man who had always defended her. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital administrator. Board meeting in progress. Please stand by. She looked at her reflection in the darkened screen. For the first time, the armor felt heavy. For the first time, the certainty cracked, not under public pressure, but under the gaze of the person who had given her a moral compass she'd quietly discarded. Elsewhere, Zayden sat beside Micah's bed. The room dim, machines murmuring softly. Micah slept, peaceful now, color back in his cheeks. Jesse leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the news replay. Earl's statement on a muted TV. They're gonna fire her, Jesse said quietly. Zayden didn't look up. That won't fix what she did. No, Jesse agreed, but it might stop her from doing it again. Zayden thought of the hallway, the security guards, the way his voice had needed a camera to matter. I don't want her gone, he said. I want them to listen the first time next time. Back in the boardroom, the vote was called. Hands rose, some reluctantly, some with relief. The decision formed like a storm front. Termination. But protocol demanded one last step. Marlene's phone buzzed again. Please come to the boardroom. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked down the hall she'd walked for decades. Faces turned away as she passed. A few met her eyes, uncertain. She entered the room and took the seat offered without ceremony. The chair spoke, voice formal. We are considering permanent termination based on the findings presented. Marlene listened, jaw set, as the summary unfolded. The footage, the documents, the pattern, the father's statement. Before we vote, the chair continued, you may address the board. The room went still. Marlene looked around. At the institution she had given her life to. At the people who had praised her efficiency and relied on her hardness. She thought of Lily. Of the story she had clung to, because it gave her grief a shape she could manage. She thought of Earl's words. Of the march. Of the hand she'd held so tightly. She stood. I won't apologize for triage, she began, voice steady. I won't pretend that medicine isn't about choices. A murmur rippled. But, she continued, the word catching slightly. I will say this. If you end me to save yourselves, you change nothing. You fire a person and keep a practice. You trade a headline for a habit. The chair leaned back. Is this your plea? Marlene met his gaze. My plea is that you stop pretending this was just me. Silence stretched. Outside, cameras waited. Inside, the board exchanged looks that said everything and nothing. The chair nodded once. We will deliberate. Marlene sat back down, heart pounding, the echo of her father's judgment still ringing. She didn't know if she had saved herself or sealed her fate. And somewhere between the boardroom and the bedside, the truth hovered, impatient. As the board prepares to decide Marlene's fate, she makes one last plea, one that could expose the entire system, or end her career forever. The day Marlene Whitaker agreed to speak publicly, the air felt heavier than it should have. Normally, press conferences were crisp affairs, statements read, cameras flashed, and afterward the world moved on. But this wasn't normal. Not anymore. Mercy Grace's scandal had grown tentacles, lawsuits, protests, social media fires that refused to be put out, and the unshakable truth that an emergency room nurse had nearly let a child die because she believed some lives mattered less. The entire city seemed to hold its breath waiting for her word. The conference room was set up outside Mercy Grace's main entrance, a temporary podium, microphones bundled together like a bouquet of statements, and reporters packed shoulder to shoulder behind barricades. Protesters lingered at a distance, signs still in hand, their chants softened into murmurs by snow that fell slow but insistent. Even the chill in the air felt poignant, as though the world around them mourned the idea that a place meant for healing had become a symbol of harm. Marlene stood at the podium in her plain gray blazer, eyes shielded by the early morning sun. Her hair was pulled back, not in the meticulously controlled bun she wore at the hospital, but loose, as if intentionally unpolished, vulnerable, or perhaps unguarded. She cleared her throat once, long enough for silence to thicken. Cameras clicked rapidly, lenses trained on her like a jury, waiting for confession. My name is Marlene Whitaker, she began, voice steady but with an edge that suggested something unsaid. I've served as a nurse for decades, and I have dedicated my life to caring for patients. Her gaze flicked briefly to a cluster of protesters before settling back on the array of microphones. What happened with the Cole brothers was tragic, and I deeply regret the outcome that nearly cost young Micah his life. A collective exhale rippled through the crowd. That was the moment people thought she would break. The moment they believed she would own the truth, acknowledge harm, and step back from the precipice of denial and defensiveness. But apologies are delicate things, and Marlene had never been good at being delicate. And yet, she continued, her tone shifting, almost imperceptibly at first. What has been lost in this conversation is context. I was thrust into a situation that was reported inaccurately and sensationalized, without acknowledgement of the realities of emergency medicine. Gasps peppered through the reporters. Some scribbled furiously. Others instinctively leaned forward, sensing the pivot. What? The media did, Marlene said, eyes scanning the horizon, like she was addressing a crowd far larger than the press present, was extract a moment and ascribe malicious intent without understanding the full circumstances. I have a history of service. I have spent countless hours trying to uphold care standards in a system that is chronically strained. To insinuate that I, or any of my colleagues, acted out of racial bias is not only incorrect, it is a disservice to the profession and to the very patients we strive to help. It was not an apology. It was a defense masquerading as one. The reporters' faces stuttered between shock and disbelief. A video camera for a major local station picked up every syllable, broadcasting it live. Across social platforms, the phrase chronically strained began trending as critics dissected her statement in real time. A protester shouted from the back, "You almost killed a kid," and the crowd near them echoed the sentiment with boos and raised signs. It was the first public eruption since the conference began. Marlene's lips tightened, but she did not flinch. I am not here to be cancelled, she said next, the word carrying a sharp drill of defiance. I am here to defend my record and to clarify that trauma, personal trauma, informs every decision we make in medical practice. I have experienced great loss in my life. I have walked through pain and grief. I have spent nights in hospital corridors, watching patients fight for breath, for life, for moments that many take for granted. Now, some reporters craned their necks, sensing something unexpected, that this was no longer a simple deflection, but a raw admission of personal fragility, interwoven with professional justification. Marlene's voice wavered, not with remorse, but with a vulnerable pride that was as jarring as it was revealing. When you strip away the headlines, she said, you find a healthcare professional trying to navigate a flawed system while bearing the weight of loss. I ask you to see me as a nurse first, not as a villain. The crowd did not erupt in sympathy. It fired back in accusations. One reporter asked the question everyone was thinking. Do you believe your personal experiences affected how you treated Zayden and Micah? Marlene paused, and in that moment of stillness, something broke. Not her voice. She didn't raise it, but the veneer that had shielded her for years. My experiences shape me, she responded, tone rigid. But they do not absolve me of responsibility. They contextualize it. And I refuse to be cast as a caricature in a narrative that benefits from simplification. When simplification was followed moments later by the phrase cancel culture attack, the room shifted again. This was no longer about nuance. This was about defense, projection, and a refusal to accept culpability. Within minutes, protesters' chants grew louder. News anchors replayed her words, juxtaposing them with footage of her dismissing Zayden in the ER. Social media threads exploded with critiques. This isn't context, it's deflection. A nurse shouldn't hide behind trauma to explain negligence. She just admitted she let bias dictate care. Back at the hospital, even some staff members watched in disbelief. Some shook their heads. A few nurses turned off the live feed quietly, exchanging looks that suggested exhaustion, not for the apology, but for the justification masquerading as one. Meanwhile, Zayden sat in Jesse's living room, the television muted, scrolling through the news updates on his phone. Micah was asleep in the bedroom, resting after his surgery, stronger each day but still fragile. Zayden's jaw was tight, his eyes tired, as he watched clips of Marlene on the podium. It wasn't an apology. He could see that. It was an attempt to rewrite the narrative mid-sentence. Jesse sat beside him with a cup of tea, not speaking, just offering presence. Words felt inadequate against the tidal wave of public discourse. But after a few moments of silence, Jesse spoke. She didn't say sorry, he said gently. No, Zayden replied. She said she was misunderstood. That was worse, Zayden realized. Not denial, but absolution through concealment. Not accountability, but story control. Then his phone buzzed, a message notification from an email address he didn't recognize. Curious, he opened it. The subject line read, "Opportunity, read immediately." He frowned. Emails had been flooding him. From supporters offering help, activists linking petitions, even universities praising his bravery. But this looked different. Professional, formal, not a donation, not a campaign. He clicked it open. The letter began, "Dear Zayden Cole, we at St. Augustine Medical University have been following your story closely. Your courage, clarity under pressure, and deep understanding of medical history at such a young age have not gone unnoticed. It is clear to us that you possess a rare commitment to life and learning that transcends circumstance." His breath caught. The next line was the one that made his heart thunder. "We are offering you a full scholarship to study medicine at St. Augustine beginning this upcoming academic year. We would be honored to support your journey toward becoming a future physician." Zayden stared at the words, disbelief tightening his chest. He read the sentence again. Full scholarship, medicine, honor. His fingers trembled. Jesse leaned in, eyes widening. "Is that real?" I think so," Zayden whispered. They even attached contact info and a faculty advisor's number. A lump rose in his throat. Hope, shock, and something heavy that tasted like justice. It felt too huge to breathe around. "How are you going to respond?" Jesse asked. Zayden didn't know. His eyes returned to the email, to the words that felt like a future unfolding in real time. A future he never dared imagine. His life had pivoted around emergency rooms and racism long enough. Maybe now it pivoted toward healing. But before he could think beyond that moment, there was another alert. A breaking news banner flashed on TV in the corner. Marlene Whitaker's public statement sparks outrage. Debate over racism in healthcare erupts nationwide. And beneath that headline, Another line scrolled just as fast. University officials hail Zayden Cole as new face of medicine. Zayden's breath caught again. This time not from shock, but from the collision of two worlds. A future opening before him, and a past still raging behind him. The letter is from a hospital offering Zayden a full scholarship to study medicine. The first snowfall of Christmas morning fell like a promise, soft, slow, and impossibly white, against the gray of the city. Families drifted into the Grand Mall atrium, adorned with lights and decorations that sparkled like a celebration everyone hoped would quiet last year's pain. Children tugged at parents' sleeves, couples sipped steaming cups of cocoa. Somewhere, carolers hummed beneath a giant evergreen twinkling overhead. But beneath the cheer there was a heartbeat of tension. This city carried a memory named Zayden Cole. It had been almost exactly 1 year since Mercy Grace Hospital nearly lost Micah, and 1 year since the world learned the truth about how a teenage brother's knowledge and courage had outpaced a system that was supposed to protect. Since then, Zayden had walked lightly through life, admired by strangers, courted by universities, cradled by activists, but still just a kid learning how to carry both trauma and hope. On this chilly Christmas day, he was not planning to be a hero. He was here with Micah, now lively, blonding at the tips of his curls, a goofy grin plastered across his face as he pointed at the animated holiday displays. They had come with Jesse, who insisted on treating them to breakfast in the food court before a day of movies and cheap gifts. For the first time in a long while, all three of them felt ordinary. But ordinary has a way of being disrupted by a heartbeat. Skipped. The plaza's joyful noise turned to alarm in a fraction of seconds. A man, middle-aged, business casual, phone still in hand, collapsed suddenly beside the fountain, his body folding like broken origami. Groans and gasps rippled through the crowd. People edged away. A small child screamed. Parents reached instinctively for children whose eyes were already wide with confusion. In the rush of panic, someone dropped a cup of hot cider. Behind it, iced tiles glinted treacherously. "Call 911, someone shouted.
Is he breathing?
"Don't touch him." Voices rose in dissonance. Chaos disguised as concern. But then from the periphery of the crowd, a familiar voice broke through the clamor. Calm, sure, and unafraid. "Stand back," Zayden said, already crouching beside the man. "Check for breathing." People hesitated, uncertain why a kid, and that kid was speaking with authority. But his voice carried something that demanded attention, because it was not loud, it was confident. He placed 2 fingers on the man's neck, then leaned in to listen for breath against the rattling echo of the fountain behind him. The man's chest was still. No rise, no fall. Zayden looked up. Pulse. But the airways blocked. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some stepped closer. Some reached for phones. Someone already started recording. "CPR," Zayden stated. Not asked. His hands positioned over the man's chest with a precision that surprised even those who knew his story. Then he began. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The rhythm was practiced. Instinctive. Executed with a calm that betrayed the frantic energy around him. The crowd grew silent. The earlier panic seemed distant now, as though the sound of sirens and anxious murmurs had been sucked out of the air. The only sound was Zayden's breath, and him watching the man's chest under his hands. Giving. And then, a flutter, a slight rise, a breath. Someone gasped. A woman whispered, "He's breathing." More people pulled out phones. One voice, clear, excited, said, "That's the same kid the hospital called a street thug." The recording zoomed in on Zayden's focused face, his hands precise and careful, his eyes not on the crowd, but on the life unfolding beneath his palms. The video cut between the giant Christmas tree, the fountain's glittering water, and a young black teen saving a collapsing stranger in the midst of holiday chaos. Within minutes it began to spread. Teen saves man in mall. Same kid once denied care. Zayden Cole does it again. Christmas Day hero. From ER rejection to CPR perfection. Watch this. Back in the plaza, sirens wailed. The good ones. The ones that meant help was truly arriving. Medics pushed through the crowd, took over from Zayden with practiced efficiency. He stepped back, letting them work. The man was stabilized, conscious now, eyes blinking up at him, a dazed smile forming. "Thank you," the man croaked, voice weak but sincere. For the first time that day, Zayden smiled. Not because of the praise, but because a life had been reclaimed. Then Jesse and Micah were at his side. The 3 of them momentarily a triangle of relief. "You did it again, man," Jesse said quietly. Zayden exhaled. just did what was right. But even as the news crews gathered, and the medics praised his quick thinking, something raw and strange fluttered through Zayden's chest. Not pride, not relief, but resonance. The video was spreading fast, faster than last year's clips, faster than any story he'd seen, and this time it wasn't just online headlines. It was breaking news broadcasts. It was people recognizing him on the street. It was children pointing. He wasn't invisible anymore, but neither was the legacy of what had almost destroyed him. The medics helped the man into the ambulance, checked vitals once more, gave him oxygen and warmth and reassurance. The crowd dispersed slowly, chatter buzzing with admiration and disbelief. "What's his name?" Zayden asked the paramedic. The medic checked his tag. "Michael Whitaker." Zayden's head lifted. "Whitaker?" he repeated. No recognition yet, until the paramedic added, "He's the younger brother of was it Nurse Marlene Whitaker?" The world beneath Zayden's feet shifted. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran up his spine. Marlene Whitaker, the nurse whose bias nearly cost his brother his life, had family, and now her brother lay on a stretcher alive, because of him. Jesse's face went pale. Micah stared without understanding. But Zayden understood immediately. That prickling twist in the story's tale that made the moment dramatic, complicated, and unbearably human. "Are you sure?" Zayden asked. The paramedic nodded. Asked him his name. He said he was visiting family for Christmas. Didn't know much else before he collapsed. Zayden's pulse thudded in his ears. A knot of emotion, fairness, irony, unease twisted inside him. It was one thing to save a stranger. It was another to save the family of someone who almost let his brother die. He looked down at his own gloves, still tinged with the residue of the man's warmth, and wondered how context could turn a hero into a reminder of pain. The ambulance doors closed. The sirens faded. The crowd dispersed. And in that space of quiet aftermath, Zayden felt a new kind of tension settle in. Not fear, not dread, but a question without an answer. What would happen when Marlene learned her brother had been saved by the kid she once dismissed? As the crowd thinned and news crews packed away microphones, someone said, "That's the second time this kid's changed someone's life." Hands lifted phones again, replaying the clip, and the headline began to rewrite itself in real time. The same kid Mercy Grace called a street thug just saved the life of a Whitaker. The irony was so sharp it cut deep. But before Zayden could digest the collision of history and present, his phone buzzed, multiple notifications, messages from friends, journalists, supporters, and one unfamiliar number that blinked with urgency. The message was short but impactful. "Call me. Urgently. We have new information on the Whitaker family connection." Zayden's thumb hovered over the screen. His heart thudded. The Christmas lights shimmered behind him. The mall now quieter. The air still. And in that moment Zayden realized, the story wasn't over. It had just taken a turn he never saw coming. The patient he saved. Marlene's estranged younger brother. The auditorium was vast. A cathedral of light and sound, filled with thousands of chairs facing a stage made to feel intimate, despite its size. Banners along the walls read, "Ideas worth spreading," in bold, elegant typeface. But for tens of thousands of viewers watching online, it was more than a slogan. It was a culmination of a journey that had begun in a freezing hospital corridor months earlier. At center stage, lit by warm spotlights that softened the enormity of the moment, stood Zayden Cole, no longer the ragged teenager struggling for his brother's life, but a young man in a tailored suit, confident and poised. Yet inside he felt both raw and steady, like someone who had made peace with the battles he'd fought, and the scars they left behind, but who also knew the fight for justice was far from over. He scanned the crowd before speaking, his gaze lingering on familiar faces. Travis Dorsey sat near the front, his posture uncharacteristically still. A veteran janitor turned whistleblower whose quiet courage had set much in motion. Beside him was Jesse McNair, the paramedic whose off-duty choice to help Zayden and Micah had cost him professionally, but defined him personally, becoming a symbol of integrity in motion. In the third row, almost buried in the sea of listeners, sat Earl Whitaker, Marlene's father and a retired civil rights lawyer whose own moral reckoning had helped shift the narrative in a family fractured by bias. And as the lights rose to full brightness on stage, Zayden's eyes found their way to the back row, where a muted screen showed Marlene Whitaker's face, her expression measured, maybe contemplative as she watched from a break room television at the low-income clinic where she now worked under supervision, a space far from the authority she once wielded. Zayden took a breath. His voice didn't waver. "Thank you," he began, eyes lifting to meet the audience. "Thank you for being here. And to those watching across the world, thank you for listening. The applause was quiet at first, respectful, but it grew swiftly, as though every person in the room felt the weight of his story even before he told it. He began where it all started, not with anger, not with accusation, but with memory. 1 year ago, he said, I was a kid carrying my little brother through a snowstorm. Every step felt like wading through something heavier than winter. I wasn't thinking about a future. I was thinking about keeping his heart beating. A few listeners leaned in, sensing the emotional terrain of his narrative. I wasn't a model patient, a perfectly documented case, or someone with insurance that looked pretty on a chart. I was just a brother trying to save another brother. And what almost killed us wasn't illness. It was the way systems are allowed to decide whose lives matter and whose do not. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, not shock but recognition. Many had seen stories like his in headlines. Few had heard them told with such clarity from the center of truth. Zayden didn't pause. He described the ER doors sliding shut when he begged for help. The way a nurse had dismissed him as a street kid. The hours he waited in the cold before help finally came. And the suffocating fear that came with watching someone you love slip away, because no one else saw what you saw. There were moments when his voice cracked, not from weakness but from the enormity of reliving pain, in order to heal it. He spoke of Micah's surgery, the allergy he alone had remembered, the alarm that blared just in time, and the gut-level certainty that the system had almost failed him again. He spoke of the footage that had gone viral, of a niece's brave confession that exposed private bias, of protests in front of Mercy Grace, of a father disowning his own daughter on camera, and of the hospital's attempt to bury truth before it had even seen light. But through all of it, Zayden spoke not with bitterness, but with a kind of compassionate clarity that unsettled listeners more deeply than anger ever could. I'm not here to shame, he said, eyes sweeping the hall. I'm here to change. I'm here because too many families carry silent passwords for survival. Diagnoses, insurance, networks, privilege, and too many others carry wounds that never heal because no one chose to see them. He shifted then, and the room leaned in. The tone remained calm, grounded, but the words pierced like flares. Justice is not something you announce. It's something you practice. His gaze found Earl Whitaker's again, and there was respect there, not just personal, but generational. My story isn't unique. It's one thread in a tapestry of human lives strained at the edges by prejudice, by fear, by assumptions that are dressed up as protocol. Zayden paused, holding the silence, letting the weight of those words settle. And so, he continued, I stand here not as a victim of a system, but as its witness. We stand here because every step backward toward fairness, every policy revised, every life given attention instead of dismissal, that's the legacy we are building. Not one built on anger, but on accountability and compassion. The applause that followed was deep and resonant, not polite but deeply felt. People rose to their feet, not because Zayden had given them a speech, but because he had given them a lens through which they could see both the system and themselves more clearly. He smiled, almost humbly, and then turned his attention to the unexpected twist that made this moment even more powerful. A large screen behind him flickered to life, and a new image appeared. The mall video from the previous Christmas day, the one that went viral with the caption, "That's the same kid the hospital called a street thug." The video showed Zayden at a crowded shopping center on Christmas morning, calm amidst chaos, performing CPR on a man who had collapsed without warning. The crowd around him was frenzied, uncertain, until he stepped into action, hands steady, voice clear, breathing life back into a stranger's body, with a precision that came from more than knowledge. It came from compassion refined by hardship. When I talk about healing, Zayden said softly, I don't just mean medical healing. I mean the healing that happens when we value each other as human beings first. The screen shifted, revealing the face of the man whose heartbeat returned that day, the one whose life Zayden had steadied until paramedics arrived. And the audience gasped. It was Marlene Whitaker's estranged younger brother, a man named James Whitaker, whose presence in the crowd was confirmed by the next cut of footage, showing him waking up in the hospital, confused but alive. As news anchors confirmed his identity, the auditorium was stunned into silence. Why? Because the man Marlene had tried to protect, the family she had distanced herself from, the brother she had barely mentioned in years, was the very life Zayden had saved. The twist was cinematic in its symmetry, and devastating in its emotional resonance. It meant that the person whose death might have haunted the Whitaker family for decades had been prevented, not by privilege, nor by protocol, but by the very young man Marlene had dismissed. A hush fell over the room. Some people looked down at their hands. Others stared at the ceiling as if searching for meaning. A few blinked quickly, not wanting to cry in public, but unable to stop the emotion welling up. Zayden didn't flinch. He had told the story honestly, and now the universe had completed the circle. Life, he said quietly, has a way of reminding us that the heart we judge today may be the heart we need to save tomorrow. Travis sat forward, eyes shining. Jesse wiped a tear from his cheek. Earl Whitaker's expression was complex. Pride, sorrow, and reflective wonder all woven together. And somewhere, on a small screen in a break room far away, Marlene watched. The microphone in Zayden's hand was still warm. His voice settled into its final cadence. "We called me a street kid," he said, eyes sweeping the auditorium one last time. "But I became the reason someone's heart beat again." The applause rose in a thunderous wave, not a moment of celebration, but a moment of collective acknowledgement. Not just for Zayden the speaker, but for Zayden the human being, a young man who had walked through fire and brought others to warmth. The world didn't just listen, the world changed. Zayden closes with a haunting sentence. "They called me a street kid, but I became the reason someone's heart beat again." If you believe no child should be judged by their skin before they're even seen as human, type yes in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone in power ignore pain just because of where it came from? Subscribe for more stories that demand change, not silence, because sometimes the smallest voice holds the power to heal what the system refused to see.